Hello and welcome to Napflix. Tonight we are going to explore 100 facts about gardens and gardening. Not the pristine, impossible gardens of magazines and television. The real ones. The ones with mud on the path and slugs in the lettuce and a compost heap in the corner that smells like the earth remembering what it used to be. This is about the quiet, patient, endlessly rewarding act of putting something in the ground and watching it grow. The soil that contains more life in a single teaspoon than there are people on the planet. The companion planting systems that Native Americans perfected thousands of years before modern agriculture existed. The pruning cuts that make the difference between a plant that thrives and a plant that sulks. The compost that turns kitchen waste into black gold. The seeds that wait decades for a single storm. The worms that Darwin loved more than finches. The raised beds and the herb spirals and the wildflower meadows and the ancient, irreplaceable wisdom of people who have been growing things since before civilization had a name. You do not need to stay awake for all of it. You do not need to remember any of it. Just let the words carry you. If your eyes grow heavy, let them close. If your mind begins to drift, let it drift. This is your time to rest. And if you enjoy what you hear, a like or subscribe helps others find their way here too. Now, let us begin. A teaspoon of healthy garden soil contains more living organisms than there are people on Earth. Roughly 10 billion microbes inhabit that tiny volume. Bacteria form the largest population, hundreds of different species breaking down organic matter, cycling nitrogen and producing antibiotics that suppress disease. Fungi weave through the gaps between soil particles, their filaments so fine that a single gram of soil may contain several kilometers of fungal thread. Protozoa hunt bacteria, releasing the nutrients locked inside them back into the soil in forms that plant roots can absorb. Nematodes patrol the spaces between grains of sand. And beneath all of this, the chemistry of minerals, organic matter, water, and air creates a system so complex that scientists have mapped only a fraction of it. The single most important thing a gardener can do is feed this underground community. Not the plants, the soil. When you add compost, mulch, leaf mold, or any organic matter to your garden, you are not fertilizing in the traditional sense. You are feeding the billions of organisms that, in turn, feed your plants. Healthy soil grows healthy plants. Everything else follows from that. Watering in the early morning is better than watering in the evening, and the reason is fungal disease. When you water in the evening, the leaves and soil surface remain wet through the cool night hours, creating exactly the damp, still conditions that fungal spores need to germinate and infect plant tissue. Powdery mildew, downy mildew, blight, and black spot all thrive in prolonged surface moisture. Watering in the early morning gives the leaves time to dry as the day warms, reducing the window of vulnerability. Morning watering also means the soil is moist during the hours when plants are most actively growing and photosynthesizing, so the water is used more efficiently. If you cannot water in the morning, watering at the base of the plant rather than over the foliage achieves the same protection, directing water to the roots where it is needed and keeping the leaves dry. The best gardeners water deeply and less, frequently encouraging roots to grow downward in search of moisture rather than clustering near the surface, where they are vulnerable to drought. A long, slow soak twice a week does more for a garden than a brief sprinkle every day. Compost is not rot, it is controlled decomposition performed by billions of organisms working together in a living system. When you build a compost heap, you are creating an ecosystem. Bacteria arrive first, breaking down the simplest sugars and starches and generating heat as they work. The temperature inside a well-built compost pile can reach 60 degrees Celsius within days, hot enough to kill weed seeds and pathogenic bacteria. As the pile cools, fungi take over, breaking down tougher materials like cellulose and lignin. Actinomycetes produce the earthy smell that is characteristic of good compost. Millipedes, woodlice, and mites shred larger pieces of material. Earthworms arrive last, pulling the decomposed matter through their bodies and producing castings rich in plant-available nutrients. The key to good compost is balance. Roughly equal volumes of green material, which is rich in nitrogen, things like grass clippings, vegetable scraps, and coffee grounds, and brown material, which is rich in carbon, things like dried leaves, cardboard, and straw. Too much green and the heap becomes slimy and smells of ammonia. Too much brown and it sits there doing nothing for months. The right balance produces heat, activity, and a dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling substance that bears no resemblance to the waste it began as. A well-managed compost heap is the most valuable thing in any garden. Companion planting with marigolds protects vegetable crops, and the science behind it is more interesting than most gardeners realize. The roots of Tagetes species, the common marigolds found in garden centers everywhere, release a compound called alpha-terthional into the surrounding soil. This compound is toxic to root knot nematodes, microscopic worms that attack the root systems of vegetable crops and cause billions of dollars in agricultural damage globally each year. The marigolds do not just repel the nematodes, they kill them. Farmers across India, sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, and parts of southern Europe plant rings of bright orange marigolds around fields of tomatoes, beans, and peppers as a pesticide-free defense system. But marigolds do more than protect roots. Their flowers attract hoverflies, lacewings, and parasitic wasps, beneficial insects whose larvae consume enormous numbers of aphids. A border of marigolds around a vegetable bed is not decoration. It is a security system working above and below the ground simultaneously. The Three Sisters is a companion planting system developed by Native American nations that is one of the most efficient food-growing methods ever designed. Corn, beans, and squash are planted together in the same mound, and each one supports the others. The corn grows tall, providing a natural pole for the beans to climb. The beans fix nitrogen from the air and deposit it in the soil through nodules on their roots, feeding the corn and the squash, which are both heavy feeders. The squash spreads its large, prickly leaves across the ground, shading the soil to suppress weeds, retain moisture, and discourage raccoons and other animals from walking through the planting. The three crops complement each other nutritionally as well. Corn provides carbohydrates. Beans provide protein and essential amino acids that corn lacks. Squash provides vitamins, fats from the seeds, and calories. Together, they form a nearly complete diet. The Haudenosaunee, the Cherokee, the Pueblo, and dozens of other nations grew the Three Sisters for centuries before European contact. It was not a primitive method. It was a sophisticated, self-sustaining polyculture that modern agricultural science is only now beginning to appreciate. Raised bed gardening produces up to 4 times more food per square meter than traditional row planting, and the reasons are straightforward. In a traditional garden, rows of crops are separated by wide paths that allow the gardener to walk between them. These paths waste space, and the soil beneath them becomes compacted by foot traffic, which restricts root growth, reduces drainage, and limits the activity of soil organisms. A raised bed eliminates the paths. The gardener works from the edges, never stepping on the growing area, so the soil stays loose and well aerated. Plants can be spaced more closely because they do not need to accommodate a walking lane. The beds warm up faster in spring because the soil is elevated above ground level, extending the growing season by days or even weeks. And because the bed is a defined space, it is easier to amend the soil precisely, adding compost, adjusting pH, or improving drainage exactly where it is needed without wasting materials on paths. A raised bed does not need to be elaborate. 4 planks of untreated wood screwed together at the corners and filled with a mixture of garden soil and compost will outperform a traditional plot of the same size in its first season. Mulching is one of the simplest and most effective things a gardener can do, and most gardeners do not do enough of it. A layer of organic mulch, spread 3 to 5 inches deep over the soil surface around plants, does several things simultaneously. It suppresses weeds by blocking the light that weed seeds need to germinate. It retains moisture by reducing evaporation from the soil surface, cutting water requirements by as much as 50%. It regulates soil temperature, keeping roots cooler in summer and warmer in winter. And it feeds the soil as it breaks down, adding organic matter that sustains the microbial community beneath the surface. Almost any organic material can be used as mulch. Straw, wood chips, bark, leaf mold, grass clippings, and compost all work. Each has slightly different properties. Wood chips break down slowly and are best around perennials and trees. Straw is excellent around vegetables. Grass clippings are free and abundant, but should be applied in thin layers to avoid matting. The only rule is that the mulch should not touch the stems of plants directly, because trapped moisture against the stem can cause rot. Everything else about mulching is forgiving, generous, and almost impossible to get wrong. Deadheading, the practice of removing spent flowers before they set seed, is one of the most reliable ways to extend the flowering season of many garden plants. The reason is biological. A flowering plant has one primary goal: to reproduce. Once a flower is pollinated and begins to form seed, the plant's energy shifts away from producing new blooms and toward ripening those seeds. By removing the spent flower before the seed develops, you interrupt this process. The plant, still driven to reproduce, responds by producing more flowers. Roses, dahlias, sweet peas, cosmos, zinnias, and many other garden favorites respond dramatically to regular deadheading, sometimes doubling or tripling their total bloom count over a season. The technique is simple. Cut or pinch the spent flower just above the nearest set of healthy leaves or the nearest bud. For plants with multiple flower heads on a single stem, remove the individual spent flowers first, then cut the entire stem back when all the flowers on it have finished. A few minutes of deadheading every few days, a quiet task that can be done with a cup of tea in one hand, can transform a garden from a brief burst of colour into a display that lasts from early summer to the first frost. Earthworms are the most important animal in any garden. Charles Darwin devoted the final decades of his life to studying them, and his 1881 book on the subject sold more copies in its first year than On the Origin of Species had. Darwin called them the most important creatures in the history of the world. Worms eat dead organic matter and digest it through their bodies, mixing it with soil particles and microbial enzymes. Their castings contain 5 times more nitrogen, 7 times more phosphorus, and 11 times more potassium than the surrounding soil. A healthy garden may contain over 1 million earthworms per acre, and together they can turn over roughly 40 tons of soil per hectare per year. They aerate the ground, creating channels for water and air to reach plant roots. They mix the layers of the soil, bringing nutrients from below to the surface and pulling organic matter from the surface into the depths. Darwin spent 39 years observing them. He measured how fast they buried objects. He tested whether they could hear by playing bassoon to them. They could not hear, but they could feel vibrations. The man who explained evolution spent his final years on his knees in the garden, watching worms do the quiet, essential work that makes all other life possible. Hardening off is one of the most overlooked steps in gardening, and skipping it kills more seedlings than any pest or disease. When you start seeds indoors on a windowsill in a greenhouse or under grow lights, the young plants grow in a sheltered environment with no wind, no temperature fluctuation, and no direct, unfiltered sunlight. If you move them straight outside into the garden, the shock can be severe. The wind dries out leaves faster than the roots can replace the moisture. Unfiltered sunlight scorches tissue that has never been exposed to UV radiation. Cold nights slow growth or kill tender cells. Hardening off is the process of gradually introducing seedlings to outdoor conditions over a period of 7 to 10 days. On the first day, place them outside in a sheltered, shaded spot for an hour or two. Then bring them back inside. Each day, increase the time outside and gradually move them into more exposed positions with more direct light. By the end of the week, the seedlings have thickened their stems, developed a waxy coating on their leaves to reduce water loss, and adjusted their cellular chemistry to handle temperature swings. The process requires patience, but the difference in survival rate is dramatic. A hardened-off seedling planted into the garden grows immediately. An unhardened seedling often sits in shock for weeks, if it survives at all. Crop rotation is one of the oldest and most effective gardening techniques, and the principle is simple. Different plant families take different nutrients from the soil and are susceptible to different diseases. If you grow tomatoes in the same bed every year, the soil becomes depleted of the specific nutrients tomatoes need, while soil-borne diseases that affect tomatoes like blight and fusarium wilt build up in the ground. Moving the tomatoes to a different bed and replacing them with a crop from a different family breaks the disease cycle and allows the soil to recover. A basic 4-year rotation for a vegetable garden groups crops into families: legumes, which fix nitrogen and improve the soil; brassicas, which are heavy feeders; root vegetables, which break up compacted soil; and fruiting crops like tomatoes, peppers, and squash. Each group moves to the next bed each year, completing the cycle in 4 seasons. The Romans practiced crop rotation. Medieval European farmers used a 3-field system. Smallholders in Asia, Africa, and the Americas have rotated crops for millennia. The technique requires no equipment, no expense, and no expertise beyond a simple plan. It is one of those rare garden practices that costs nothing and gives back everything. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. This old proverb captures something important about the long game of gardening, but there is a practical truth behind it as well. A tree planted in autumn establishes roots through the cool, moist winter months, when the soil is still warm from summer but the air temperature has dropped. The tree is dormant, putting no energy into leaf growth, so all of its resources go into root development. By spring, an autumn-planted tree has a head start of several months over a tree planted in spring, and it is significantly more drought-resistant in its first summer because its root system is already established. Spring planting works too, but the tree must simultaneously grow roots and produce leaves, dividing its energy at a time when the soil is still cold and the days are getting warmer. If you plant in spring, the tree will need more watering in its first summer to compensate for the smaller root system. Either way, the tree gets planted, and 20 years from now, no one will remember which season you chose. They will only notice the shade. Mycorrhizal fungi are one of the most powerful allies a gardener can have, and most gardeners do not know they exist. These fungi attach to plant roots and extend outward into the soil, in a network of filaments so fine that they can access water and nutrients in spaces that roots alone cannot reach. A plant with a healthy mycorrhizal partnership can effectively extend its root system by up to 700 times. The fungi are particularly effective at accessing phosphorus, a nutrient that is essential for flowering and fruiting, but is often locked in soil minerals that roots cannot dissolve. The fungi dissolve it and deliver it directly to the plant in exchange for sugars produced by photosynthesis. Over 90% of all plant species form mycorrhizal partnerships, and the relationship is at least 400 million years old. You can buy mycorrhizal fungi as a powder or granule and add it directly to the planting hole when you transplant seedlings, plant trees, or establish new perennials. The fungi colonize the roots within days and begin extending the network immediately. It is one of the few garden products that genuinely works as advertised, because it is not a product at all, it is a living organism doing what it has done since before plants had leaves. Pruning at the right time makes the difference between a plant that flowers abundantly and a plant that barely flowers at all, and the rule is simpler than most people think. Plants that flower in spring and early summer, like forsythia, lilac, wisteria, and philadelphus, bloom on wood that grew the previous year. This is called old wood. If you prune these plants in winter or early spring, you cut off the buds that were already formed and waiting, and the plant will not flower that year. The correct time to prune them is immediately after they finish flowering, giving the plant the rest of the growing season to produce new wood that will carry next year's blooms. Plants that flower in mid to late summer, like buddleia, hydrangea paniculata, lavender, and most roses, bloom on wood that grows in the current year. This is called new wood. These plants are pruned in late winter or early spring, cutting them back hard before new growth begins, which encourages vigorous new shoots that will carry flowers later that same summer. The rule is straightforward. If it flowers before midsummer, prune it after it flowers. If it flowers after midsummer, prune it in late winter. 2 sentences. A lifetime of better flowering. Baking soda has been used by gardeners for generations as a simple, inexpensive way to sweeten tomatoes. Sprinkling a small amount of baking soda around the base of tomato plants reduces the acidity of the soil in the immediate root zone, and some gardeners report that this produces sweeter fruit. The chemistry is plausible. Tomato flavor is a balance of sugars and acids, and reducing the acid content shifts the balance towards sweetness. However, the effect is subtle and depends heavily on the existing soil pH, the variety of tomato, and the growing conditions. Baking soda has other uses in the garden as well. A solution of 1 tablespoon of baking soda, a few drops of liquid soap, and a gallon of water sprayed on the leaves of roses, squash, and cucumbers creates a mildly alkaline surface that inhibits the germination of powdery mildew spores. It is not a cure for established mildew, but as a preventive measure applied early in the season, it can reduce the severity of outbreaks. A household ingredient, a spray bottle, and a few minutes of application. The simplest tools are often the most useful ones. The smell of freshly turned earth is caused by a compound called geosmin, and it is one of the most universally pleasant scents humans can detect. Geosmin is produced by soil bacteria, primarily species in the genus Streptomyces, as they break down organic matter. The human nose is extraordinarily sensitive to it, able to detect it at concentrations as low as 5 parts per trillion. This sensitivity is thought to be evolutionary. In arid environments, the smell of geosmin, which is released when dry soil is moistened by rain, would have signaled the presence of water. Our ancestors who could smell it from a distance had a survival advantage. The closely related scent of rain on dry ground, called petrichor, is produced by a combination of geosmin and oils released by plants during dry periods, which are carried into the air by raindrops striking the soil. When you turn over a spadeful of earth in the garden and breathe in that deep, rich, unmistakable smell, you are inhaling the work of billions of bacteria. And the reason it smells so good, the reason it makes you feel something, is because your brain is wired to associate that smell with life. Succession planting is one of the simplest ways to ensure a continuous harvest from a vegetable garden, and most home gardeners do not do it. The principle is straightforward. Instead of sowing all of your lettuce, radishes, or beans at once and harvesting them all at the same time, you sow a small amount every 2 to 3 weeks throughout the growing season. Each sowing matures at a different time, giving you a steady supply rather than a single overwhelming glut followed by nothing. Lettuce is the classic example. A single sowing of lettuce will be ready to harvest within 6 to 8 weeks. If you sow it all at once, you will have more lettuce than you can eat for 2 weeks, and then none for the rest of the summer. If you sow a short row every fortnight from early spring to late summer, you will have fresh lettuce continuously for months. The same principle applies to radishes, which mature in as little as 4 weeks, spring onions, salad leaves, coriander, and dwarf beans. Succession planting requires no extra space, no extra effort, and no special knowledge. Just the discipline to sow a little at a time, regularly, rather than everything at once. The garden rewards patience, and succession planting is patience made practical. A wildflower meadow supports 50 times more pollinators than a mown lawn. In 2019, researchers in the United Kingdom measured pollinator activity across different types of green space and found that converting a single hectare of regularly mown grass to wildflower meadow increased pollinator visits by roughly 5,000%. The reason is not simply more flowers, it is more diversity of flowers. A monoculture lawn offers almost nothing to pollinators. No nectar, no pollen, no shelter. A wildflower meadow offers dozens of species blooming at different times, providing resources continuously from early spring to late autumn. The variety of flower shapes and sizes supports a wider range of insect species, from long-tongued bumblebees to tiny solitary bees to hoverflies and beetles. You do not need a hectare. Even converting a small patch of lawn, a few square meters in a corner of the garden, can make a meaningful difference. Stop mowing it. Scatter some native wildflower seed in autumn. Wait. The first year will look scrappy. The second year will be better. By the third year, you will have a patch of garden that hums with life in a way that the lawn it replaced never did. Willow branches soaked in water for 24 to 48 hours produce a natural rooting hormone solution that gardeners have used for centuries to help cuttings develop roots. The science behind it is genuine. Willow bark contains 2 key compounds: indolebutyric acid, a naturally occurring auxin that stimulates root growth, and salicylic acid, which helps the cutting resist bacterial infection while the wound heals. Together, these compounds give willow water a dual function, promoting roots and preventing rot. The preparation is simple. Cut a handful of young willow stems into short pieces, roughly 2 to 3 inches long. Place them in a jar or bucket and cover them with boiling water. Let the mixture steep for 24 to 48 hours, then strain out the willow pieces. The resulting liquid, a pale yellow-brown tea, can be used to soak cuttings before planting or poured around newly planted cuttings as a root drench. The effect is not as strong as commercial rooting hormone powder, but it is free, renewable, and has been shown in studies to improve rooting success rates in a wide range of plant species. A handful of willow twigs and a jar of water. a garden remedy that costs nothing and works. Epsom salts dissolved in water and applied to the soil provide magnesium, a mineral that is essential for chlorophyll production and that many garden soils lack in sufficient quantities. Chlorophyll is the green pigment that drives photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert sunlight into energy. Without adequate magnesium, chlorophyll production slows, leaves turn yellow between the veins while the veins themselves remain green, a condition called intervenal chlorosis, and the plant's ability to produce energy declines. Tomatoes, peppers, and roses are particularly susceptible to magnesium deficiency. A tablespoon of Epsom salts dissolved in a gallon of water and applied to the soil around the base of the plant once a month during the growing season can correct the deficiency. Epsom salts can also be applied as a foliar spray, dissolved in water and misted directly onto the leaves, where the magnesium is absorbed quickly. The improvement in leaf color is often visible within days. Epsom salts are inexpensive, widely available, and safe to use. They are not a universal cure for every garden problem, but for magnesium deficiency specifically, they are remarkably effective. Planting garlic around rose bushes has been used by gardeners for generations to deter aphids. The sulfur compounds in garlic, the same compounds responsible for its pungent smell and flavor, are released through the roots into the surrounding soil and through the leaves into the air. Aphids and other soft-bodied insects find these compounds repellent, and studies have confirmed that garlic-based sprays and companion plantings reduce aphid populations on nearby plants. The garlic does not need to be sacrificed. It grows happily alongside roses, occupying a different root zone and requiring minimal space. The cloves are planted in autumn around the base of the rose bush, roughly 15 centimeters apart, and they grow through winter, producing green shoots in early spring that coincide with the first aphid hatches of the season. By the time the aphids arrive, the garlic is already releasing its defensive chemistry. The bulbs can be harvested in summer after the rose has finished its first flush of blooms or left in the ground to continue their protective work. A few cloves of garlic, planted in 20 minutes on an autumn afternoon, providing pest control for an entire season with no chemicals, no sprays, and no ongoing effort. Seeds started indoors need strong light within hours of germination, and this single factor determines whether the seedling will be sturdy or leggy. When a seed germinates in dim conditions, the emerging stem elongates rapidly, stretching toward whatever faint light source is available. This stretching is called etiolation, and it produces a tall, thin, weak stem that cannot support the weight of the leaves once they develop. A leggy seedling may survive, but it will never be as strong as one that grew in adequate light from the start. The solution is to provide bright light as close to the seedlings as possible, ideally within a few centimeters of the tops of the plants. A sunny south-facing windowsill works in mild climates, but in northern latitudes during late winter and early spring, the light through a window is often insufficient, and supplemental grow lights make a significant difference. If you do not have grow lights, rotating the seed trays daily so the seedlings do not lean toward one side and keeping the room as cool as possible to slow the stretching are the best alternatives. Strong light and cool temperatures produce short, stocky, dark green seedlings. Dim light and warm temperatures produce tall, pale, floppy ones. The light matters more than the soil, more than the watering, more than anything else in the first week of a seedling's life. The finger test for watering is more reliable than any schedule, any app, and any moisture meter on the market. Push your finger 2 inches into the soil. If it feels dry at that depth, water. If it feels moist, wait. The reason this works better than a fixed schedule is that water requirements change constantly. A plant in full sun on a hot, windy day in midsummer may need water every day. The same plant on a cool, overcast day in autumn may not need water for a week. Soil type matters too. Sandy soil drains quickly and dries out fast. Clay soil holds water for days. The only way to know what your specific plants in your specific soil in your specific weather need right now is to check. The finger test takes 3 seconds. It provides immediate, accurate information. It prevents both overwatering, which drowns roots and promotes rot, and underwatering, which stresses the plant and reduces growth. Most garden problems attributed to disease or nutrient deficiency are actually watering problems in disguise. Too much water, too little water, water at the wrong time. The finger knows. Trust the finger. Adding coffee grounds to compost provides nitrogen, improves soil structure, and attracts earthworms. Coffee grounds are roughly 2% nitrogen by weight, which makes them a useful green material in the compost heap, comparable to grass clippings. They also contain potassium, phosphorus, and trace minerals. Earthworms are particularly attracted to coffee grounds, and adding them to a worm bin or compost heap increases worm activity and speeds decomposition. However, fresh coffee grounds should generally be composted first, rather than applied directly to the soil surface around plants. The grounds are slightly acidic when fresh, with a pH of around 6.5, and they can temporarily inhibit the germination of some seeds. Composting neutralizes the acidity and breaks down compounds that might otherwise be problematic. Used coffee filters can go in the compost as well, providing a small amount of carbon to balance the nitrogen in the grounds. The grounds are also useful as a gentle, abrasive mulch around plants that slugs target, though the evidence for slug deterrence is mixed and depends on conditions. A free, abundant byproduct of your morning routine, diverted from the bin to the compost heap, where it becomes part of the cycle that feeds the garden. The best garden soil is roughly 45% minerals, 25% water, 25% air, and 5% organic matter. That 5% organic matter is what separates productive soil from lifeless dirt. It sounds like a small proportion, and it is, but its influence is enormous. Organic matter feeds the soil food web, the bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and invertebrates that cycle nutrients and make them available to plant roots. It improves the structure of clay soils by creating aggregates that allow water and air to penetrate. It improves the water-holding capacity of sandy soils by acting like a sponge, retaining moisture that would otherwise drain away. It buffers soil pH, moderating extremes of acidity and alkalinity. And it releases nutrients slowly, providing a steady supply over weeks and months, rather than a single burst that leaches away with the next rain. Building organic matter in garden soil is not difficult. It simply requires adding organic material regularly, compost, mulch, leaf mold, green manures, and letting the soil organisms do the rest. The process is slow. It takes years to build significant organic matter content. But every season the soil gets better. Every year the garden grows a little more easily. And the difference between 4% organic matter and 6% organic matter is the difference between a garden that struggles and a garden that thrives. Tomatoes should be watered deeply and less frequently rather than lightly and often. A light sprinkle wets only the top inch of soil, encouraging roots to cluster near the surface where they are vulnerable to heat and drought. A deep soak, one that wets the soil to a depth of 6 to 8 inches, encourages roots to grow downward, anchoring the plant more firmly and accessing moisture reserves that surface watering never reaches. Inconsistent watering is the single biggest cause of blossom end rot, the dark, sunken patch that appears on the bottom of the fruit. Blossom end rot is not a disease. It is a calcium deficiency caused by irregular water supply, which prevents the plant from transporting calcium to the developing fruit, even when there is plenty of calcium in the soil. The solution is not more calcium. It is more consistent water. A deep soak twice a week, or 3 times in very hot weather, delivered at the base of the plant rather than over the leaves, produces healthier plants, fewer problems, and better tasting fruit than daily light watering ever will. Pinching out the growing tip of basil above a pair of leaves causes it to branch into 2 stems, and repeating this simple action transforms a single spindly seedling into a bushy, prolific plant. Most people grow basil by letting it grow upward in a single stem until it flowers, at which point the leaves become bitter and the plant stops producing new growth. Pinching prevents this. When you remove the growing tip, the plant redirects its energy to the 2 dormant buds sitting in the leaf axils just below the cut. Each of those buds grows into a new stem, each with its own set of leaves. When those new stems have developed 2 or 3 pairs of leaves, you pinch them again. 2 stems become 4. 4 become 8. Within a few weeks, a single basil plant treated this way produces more leaves than 3 or 4 unpinched plants growing side by side. The technique works on many herbs and soft-stemmed plants beyond basil. Mint, oregano, and lemon balm all respond to pinching with vigorous branching. The principle is the same. Remove the tip and the plant compensates by growing wider instead of taller. A garden compost heap at peak activity can reach internal temperatures of 60 degrees Celsius, hot enough to kill weed seeds, pathogenic bacteria, and many plant diseases. Achieving this temperature requires a balance of materials and conditions. The heap needs a roughly equal mix of green material, rich in nitrogen such as grass clippings, vegetable scraps and fresh plant trimmings, and brown material, rich in carbon such as dried leaves, cardboard, straw, and wood shavings. It needs moisture, roughly as damp as a wrung-out sponge, and it needs air, which is why turning the heap every few weeks with a fork accelerates the process dramatically. A heap that is too wet becomes anaerobic and smells of ammonia. A heap that is too dry sits dormant. A heap that is too small, less than roughly 1 cubic meter, loses heat faster than the organisms can generate it and never reaches the temperatures needed to sterilize the contents. The hot composting process can produce finished compost in as little as 8 to 12 weeks. Cold composting, where materials are simply piled and left without turning, takes 6 months to a year, but requires almost no effort. Both methods work. The hot method gives you compost faster and kills more weed seeds. The cold method asks less of you and lets the organisms work at their own pace. Nettles soaked in water for 2 weeks produce a nutrient-rich liquid feed that is high in nitrogen and iron, and gardeners have used this free fertilizer for centuries. The preparation is simple but pungent. Fill a bucket or barrel roughly halfway with fresh nettle leaves and stems, wearing gloves to avoid the sting. Top up with water. Cover loosely to allow gases to escape because the fermentation process produces a considerable smell. After 2 weeks, the nettles will have broken down into a dark, potent liquid. Strain out the solid material and dilute the remaining liquid roughly 1 part nettle tea to 10 parts water before applying it to plants. The feed is particularly good for leafy crops like lettuce, spinach, chard, and brassicas, which are heavy nitrogen users. It is also excellent for tomatoes during their early growth phase, before the fruits begin to set. When the plant is building the foliage it will need to support the crop. Comfrey leaves can be prepared the same way, producing a feed that is higher in potassium and better suited to fruiting and flowering plants. Both are free. Both are effective. And both have been part of the gardener's toolkit since long before bottled fertilizers existed. Leaving some areas of the garden deliberately untidy is one of the most effective things you can do for pest control, because the creatures that eat your pests need somewhere to live. A log pile in a shady corner provides habitat for beetles, whose larvae consume slugs. A stack of dry leaves behind a shed shelters hedgehogs, which eat slugs, snails, and caterpillars in enormous numbers through the night. An area of long, uncut grass at the edge of the garden provides cover for frogs and toads, which are voracious consumers of slugs and other invertebrates. A patch of bare soil in a sunny spot gives ground-nesting solitary bees a place to burrow. Dead flower heads left standing through winter provide seeds for birds and shelter for overwintering insects, many of which are predators of the aphids and caterpillars that would otherwise damage your crops in spring. The impulse to tidy everything, to cut every hedge, rake every leaf, and mow every edge, removes the habitat that beneficial wildlife depends on. A garden that looks slightly wild in the right places is a garden that manages its own pest problems with far less effort than one that relies on sprays and pellets. Planting flowers among your vegetables is not just decorative, it is one of the most practical things you can do to increase your harvest. Many vegetable crops, including courgettes, squash, cucumbers, runner beans, and peppers, require insect pollination to set fruit. If pollinators do not visit, the flowers drop, without producing anything. Planting pollinator-friendly flowers among and around your vegetable beds draws bees, hoverflies, and butterflies into the growing area, increasing the number of pollinator visits to your crops and directly improving yields. Borage is one of the best choices because it flowers continuously from early summer to late autumn and is irresistible to bees. Calendula, nasturtiums, phacelia, and cosmos are all excellent companions. Some of these flowers offer additional benefits. Nasturtiums attract aphids away from beans and brassicas, acting as a sacrificial trap crop. Calendula attracts hoverflies whose larvae eat aphids. Phacelia is a green manure that can be dug into the soil after flowering to add organic matter. A vegetable garden with flowers in it is not a compromise. It is a more productive garden. Potatoes can be grown in almost anything. Containers, grow bags, large pots, stacked tires, old compost sacks, and even dustbins with drainage holes drilled in the bottom all work perfectly well. This makes potatoes one of the most accessible crops for gardeners without beds or borders. The technique is called earthing up. Place a few centimeters of compost in the bottom of the container, set the seed potatoes on top, and cover them with another few centimeters of compost. As the green shoots grow upward, keep adding compost around the stems, leaving just the top few leaves exposed. The buried stems produce additional tubers along their length, so the more you earth up, the more potatoes you get. By the time the container is full, you may have layers of potatoes from bottom to top. Harvesting is as simple as tipping the container out and picking through the compost. First early varieties are ready in as little as 10 weeks from planting, and they taste incomparably better than anything from a shop because the sugars in a freshly dug potato have not yet converted to starch. The no-dig method, championed by the English gardener Charles Dowding, involves adding compost on top of the soil each year without ever turning it over, and it produces results that are equal to or better than traditional digging. The principle is based on soil science. Digging breaks up the fungal networks that connect plant roots to nutrients. It exposes soil organisms to light and air that kills them. It brings buried weed seeds to the surface where they germinate. It disrupts the layered structure of the soil that took years to develop. The no-dig method avoids all of this by simply spreading a layer of compost 3 to 5 centimeters deep on the surface of the bed each autumn or early spring. The worms pull it down. The rain washes nutrients into the root zone. The compost suppresses weeds by smothering them. The soil structure improves year on year as the biology beneath the surface is left undisturbed. Dowding has conducted side-by-side trials on his farm in Somerset, growing identical crops in dug and no-dig beds. And the no-dig beds consistently match or outperform the dug beds while requiring significantly less labor. Less work, fewer weeds, healthier soil, better results. The garden rewards you for doing less, as long as you do the right less. Garlic planted in autumn before the first hard frost develops stronger roots and produces larger bulbs than garlic planted in spring. Autumn-planted garlic, sometimes called overwintering garlic, uses the cold months to establish a root system while the soil is still warm enough for root growth, but the air is too cold for the cloves to send up green shoots. The cold period also triggers a process called vernalization, a biochemical response to prolonged low temperatures that many allium species require in order to divide into individual cloves. Without adequate cold exposure, garlic tends to produce a single, undivided bulb called a round. The cloves are separated and planted individually, pointed end up, roughly 5 centimeters deep and 15 centimeters apart. They sit in the ground through winter, and in early spring, green shoots emerge as the days lengthen. By midsummer, the bulbs are ready to harvest. The entire process from planting to pulling takes roughly 9 months, but almost all of that time is spent doing nothing. You plant it, you forget about it, you harvest it. It is one of the most rewarding crops in the garden for the amount of effort it requires. Feeding tomato plants with a potassium-rich fertilizer once the first fruits begin to set encourages more fruit production and improves flavor. During the first phase of growth, when the plant is building its stem and leaves, it needs nitrogen. But once flowering begins and the first tiny green fruits appear, the plant's nutritional needs shift. Potassium drives the production of sugars, the development of fruit, and the ripening process. A tomato plant that receives adequate potassium produces more flowers that set into fruit, develops stronger cell walls that resist cracking, and produces fruit with higher sugar content and better flavor. Commercial tomato feeds are typically high in potassium for this reason, but comfrey tea, made by soaking comfrey leaves in water for 2 to 3 weeks, provides potassium naturally and for free. Wood ash sprinkled lightly around the base of the plant is another source of potassium, though it also raises pH and should be used sparingly on acid-loving plants. The transition from nitrogen to potassium at the fruiting stage is one of the most important nutritional shifts in vegetable gardening, and getting it right makes a noticeable difference in the quantity and quality of the harvest. Many herbs, including rosemary, thyme, oregano, lavender, and sage, actually produce more intense flavor when grown in poor, well-drained soil. This seems counterintuitive. Surely a well-fed plant would be a better plant. But for Mediterranean herbs, the opposite is true. These plants evolved in thin, rocky, nutrient-poor soils under intense sun. Their essential oils, the compounds responsible for their aroma and flavor, are produced as a defense mechanism against the stress of their environment. When you grow them in rich, moist, fertile garden soil, they produce lush, soft, green growth with diluted oils and weaker flavor. When you grow them in gritty, free-draining soil with minimal feeding, the plants stay compact. The leaves are smaller and more concentrated, and the flavor is dramatically more intense. This is why rosemary growing wild on a rocky hillside in Provence smells so much stronger than rosemary growing in a well-composted English border. The herb does not want your generosity. It wants neglect. and it rewards that neglect with the best flavor it can produce. Collecting rainwater is one of the best things a gardener can do, and the reasons go beyond saving money on a water bill. Rainwater is naturally soft, meaning it contains very low levels of dissolved minerals like calcium and magnesium. Tap water, particularly in hard water areas, contains these minerals in concentrations high enough to gradually raise the pH of your soil and leave white, crusty deposits on the surface. Over time, this can make acidic-loving plants like blueberries, rhododendrons, and camellias struggle. Rainwater is also free of chlorine and fluoride, both of which are added to municipal tap water, and both of which can inhibit the activity of soil microorganisms. A water butt connected to a downpipe from your roof captures hundreds of liters of rain with no ongoing cost. The water is better for your plants, better for your soil, and available precisely when you need it most, after a dry spell when the butt is full from the last rain. A single rain event can fill a standard water butt in minutes. Storing it is free. Using it is free. And the plants, if they could tell you, would always prefer it. A herb spiral is a permaculture design that creates multiple growing conditions in a single small structure, and it is one of the most elegant and space-efficient garden features ever conceived. The spiral is built from stones, bricks, or logs, arranged in a coiling shape that rises from ground level at the outer edge to roughly a meter high at the center. The center is filled with rubble for drainage, and the growing medium varies from dry, gritty, free-draining soil at the top to moist, rich soil at the bottom. This gradient creates a range of microclimates in a footprint of only 2 or 3 square meters. Mediterranean herbs like rosemary, thyme, and oregano thrive at the sunny, dry top. Parsley and coriander prefer the middle zone. Mint and chives, which like moisture, grow at the shady, wet base. A small pond at the very bottom of the spiral can house watercress and attract frogs. The thermal mass of the stones absorbs heat during the day and releases it at night, extending the growing season and protecting tender herbs from frost. A herb spiral is a kitchen garden, a microclimate experiment, and a beautiful garden feature, all in a space the size of a dining table. Bees are most active in the garden between mid-morning and mid-afternoon, and planting a variety of flower shapes ensures you attract different species with different needs. Long-tongued bumblebees can reach into deep, tubular flowers like foxglove, honeysuckle, and penstemons. Short-tongued bees need open, flat flowers like daisies, sedums, and umbellifers, where the nectar is easily accessible. Solitary bees, which are smaller and less conspicuous than bumblebees, but equally important as pollinators, prefer small, simple flowers in clusters. Planting in blocks of single colors rather than mixed plantings makes it easier for bees to find and return to the flowers they prefer, because bees tend to forage on one species at a time, a behavior called flower constancy. Blue and purple flowers are particularly attractive to bees because their color vision peaks in the ultraviolet and blue range. But above all, the most important thing is to provide something in bloom from the earliest weeks of spring, when queens emerge hungry from hibernation, through to the last warm days of autumn. A garden with flowers in every month of the growing season is a garden that sustains pollinators through the entire cycle. And those pollinators, in return, sustain your garden. Clover was once considered a desirable and essential part of a healthy lawn. Before the 1950s, commercial grass seed mixes routinely included white clover as a standard ingredient. Clover fixes nitrogen from the air through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in its root nodules, enriching the soil and feeding the grass around it without any need for synthetic fertilizer. It stays green in drought when grass turns brown because its deep roots access moisture that shallow grass roots cannot reach. Its flowers feed bees. Its leaves are soft underfoot. It tolerates close mowing. By every practical measure, clover makes a lawn better. Then, in the 1950s, the chemical company that developed the broadleaf herbicide 2,4-D discovered that their product killed clover along with dandelions and other weeds. Rather than reformulate the herbicide to spare clover, they redefined clover as a weed, launched marketing campaigns promoting the perfect grass-only lawn, and removed clover from their own seed mixes. Within a generation, the public accepted the new definition. Clover, one of the most beneficial plants in a lawn, became the enemy, and gardeners began spending money on fertilizers to replace the nitrogen that the clover had been providing for free. Grafting, the technique of joining a cutting from one plant onto the rootstock of another so they grow as one organism, has been practiced for over 4,000 years and is how most fruit trees sold today are produced. The principle is straightforward. You take a scion, a short piece of stem from a tree whose fruit you want, and attach it to the root system of a different, usually hardier, tree. The cambium layers, the thin rings of actively dividing cells just beneath the bark, must be aligned so that the tissues of the two plants fuse together. Once the graft takes, the scion grows using the rootstock's root system, producing the fruit of the scion variety on a root system chosen for disease resistance, vigor, or dwarfing characteristics. This is why the apple tree you buy from a nursery is almost never grown from seed. A seed produces a tree with unpredictable fruit. A graft produces an exact copy of a known variety, growing on a root system selected for your soil and your space. Dwarfing rootstocks produce small trees that fruit earlier and are easier to pick. Vigorous rootstocks produce large trees that live longer and crop more heavily. The same apple variety, grafted onto different roots, can become a different sized tree with a different lifespan. The fruit is identical. The foundation it grows on determines everything else. The scent of rosemary improves memory, and the evidence is not just anecdotal. In controlled experiments, participants sitting in rooms diffused with rosemary essential oil scored significantly higher on memory tests than those in unscented rooms. The mechanism involves a compound called 1,8-cineol that enters the bloodstream through the nasal mucosa within minutes of inhalation and increases acetylcholine activity in the brain, the neurotransmitter critical for learning and recall. Greek students in antiquity wore sprigs of rosemary in their hair during examinations. Shakespeare wrote that rosemary is for remembrance. Monks in medieval Europe grew it in their gardens for mental clarity. The tradition is ancient, and the science confirms it. But for gardeners, there is a simpler lesson. Rosemary is one of the easiest herbs to grow. It tolerates drought, thrives in poor soil, needs almost no attention, and can live for over 20 years in the right conditions. Planting it beside a garden path means you brush against it every time you walk past, releasing the oils into the air. A herb that improves your memory, growing beside the path you walk every day. The garden gives you things you did not even know you needed. NASA's research into growing plants in space led to advances in hydroponic and aeroponic growing systems that are now used in urban farms and indoor gardens worldwide. The challenge of growing food in zero gravity with no soil, limited water, and restricted space forced researchers to develop methods of delivering nutrients directly to plant roots in water or mist. Hydroponics, where roots grow in a nutrient-rich water solution, and aeroponics, where roots hang in air and are periodically misted with nutrients, both originated in scientific research, but found their widest application in commercial and home growing. Aeroponic systems use up to 95% less water than soil-based growing because the nutrient mist is recirculated. Hydroponic systems allow precise control of every variable: pH, nutrient concentration, light duration, and temperature. Leafy greens like lettuce, spinach, and herbs are particularly well suited to these methods and can be grown indoors, year-round, with no soil, no weeds, and no pests. The technology that was developed to feed astronauts on the International Space Station now grows basil on kitchen counters and lettuce in converted shipping containers in city centres. A forest floor produces its own rain. In a mature forest, the trees draw water from the soil through their roots and release it as vapour from their leaves through a process called transpiration. A single large tree can transpire over 1,000 litres of water per day. This moisture rises into the atmosphere, cools, condenses, and falls again as precipitation. In the Amazon rainforest, this cycle is so powerful that the forest generates up to half of its own rainfall. The trees are not just growing in the rain, they are making the rain. When forests are cleared, the cycle breaks. Less moisture enters the atmosphere. Less rain falls. The remaining vegetation dries out. The soil loses its organic matter. The land that was once a self-watering ecosystem becomes dependent on external rainfall that may no longer be sufficient. This is one of the reasons deforestation has consequences far beyond the loss of trees. It disrupts the water cycle that the forest itself sustains. Every tree in your garden participates in this cycle on a smaller scale. Every leaf that transpires water into the air is contributing to the moisture that will eventually return as rain. Container gardens need watering more often than beds in the ground, and in hot weather, a container in full sun may need watering twice a day. The reason is volume. A plant growing in the ground has access to a vast reservoir of soil moisture extending in every direction. Its roots can grow downward and outward, following water deep into the earth. A plant in a container has only the moisture held in the compost inside the pot, and that compost is surrounded on all sides by air, which draws moisture out through the walls, particularly in terracotta pots which are porous. The smaller the container, the faster it dries. Dark-coloured containers absorb more heat and dry even faster. Grouping containers together helps because the plants shade each other's pots and create a slightly more humid microclimate. Standing pots on saucers or trays catches runoff and allows the compost to reabsorb water from below. And adding water-retaining gel crystals, or a layer of mulch on the compost surface, reduces evaporation. But the fundamental reality remains. Container gardening is watering intensive. If you accept that and plan for it, containers can grow almost anything a garden bed can. If you forget to water on a hot July afternoon, the results can be swift and unforgiving. Planting native species in your garden supports local wildlife more effectively than exotic ornamentals, because native insects, birds, and pollinators have evolved alongside native plants for thousands of years. A native oak tree in Britain supports over 280 species of insect. An ornamental cherry from Japan, beautiful as it is, supports almost none. The insects that feed on native plants are themselves food for birds, bats, hedgehogs, and frogs. The berries of native shrubs ripen at the right time for migrating birds. The nectar of native wildflowers is available when native pollinators emerge from hibernation. An exotic garden can be stunning, but it is often ecologically sterile. A beautiful desert where local wildlife finds almost nothing to eat. The shift does not need to be absolute. Even adding a few native species to an existing garden, a hawthorn hedge, a patch of native wildflowers, a rowan tree, an area of native grasses, creates corridors and feeding stations that connect your garden to the wider ecosystem. The wildlife does not need you to replace everything. It just needs you to include it. Moon gardening, planting according to the phases of the moon, has been practiced by farmers across cultures for thousands of years. The principle is that the moon's gravitational pull, which controls the tides, also influences the movement of water in soil and within plants. During the waxing moon, when the moon is growing from new to full, water is thought to rise in the soil, favoring the germination and growth of leafy crops and flowers that produce above ground. During the waning moon, when the moon is shrinking from full to new, water is thought to draw downward, favoring root crops, bulbs, and transplanting. The full moon is considered the best time for harvesting because moisture levels in the leaves are at their peak. The new moon is considered the worst time for planting because gravitational pull is at its lowest. Scientific evidence for moon gardening is limited and the mechanisms are debated. But the practice persists because generations of farmers and gardeners have observed patterns that align with the cycle. Whether it works through gravity, through light, or through the simple discipline of paying closer attention to timing, moon gardening connects the gardener to a rhythm that is older than agriculture itself. Green manures are crops grown not to harvest, but to improve the soil. Clover, field beans, phacelia, mustard, and winter rye are sown on empty beds in autumn or between crop rotations, and they are dug or cut back into the soil before they set seed. While growing, they protect the soil from erosion, suppress weeds, and maintain biological activity through the colder months. Leguminous green manures like clover and field beans fix nitrogen from the atmosphere through bacteria in their root nodules, enriching the soil for the next crop without any need for bought fertilizer. Non-leguminous green manures like phacelia and mustard produce dense root systems that break up compacted soil, and when dug in, their decomposing foliage adds organic matter. A bed left bare over winter loses nutrients to rain, develops a hard crust, and becomes colonized by weeds. A bed covered with a green manure stays soft, fertile, and weed-free. The practice costs almost nothing, a packet of seeds and 20 minutes of sowing, and it returns more to the soil than most commercial fertilizers. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault is buried deep inside a mountain on the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen, roughly 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole. It stores over 1.1 million seed samples from almost every country on Earth, kept at -18 degrees Celsius in conditions designed to preserve their viability for centuries. The vault is not a museum, it is a backup. If a crop variety is lost anywhere in the world, through war, natural disaster, disease, or simple neglect, a duplicate sample may exist in Svalbard, waiting to be retrieved and grown again. The seeds are stored in sealed foil packets inside sealed boxes on shelves, inside 3 concrete chambers carved into the permafrost. The location was chosen because the frozen ground provides natural refrigeration even if the power fails, and the mountain is high enough above sea level to remain dry even under worst-case projections of ice melt. The vault has already been used. In 2015, seeds were withdrawn to replace collections damaged during the Syrian civil war. A mountain in the Arctic storing the genetic heritage of human agriculture against a future no one can predict. Seeds can remain viable for extraordinary periods, patient beyond any human measure of patience. In 2005, scientists in Israel germinated a date palm seed recovered from the fortress of Masada that was roughly 2,000 years old. The seed, preserved by the dry desert climate, produced a healthy seedling that was nicknamed Methuselah. It grew into a mature tree and eventually produced pollen, a seed that had been sitting in the rubble of a fortress destroyed by the Roman Empire in 73 AD, germinated, grew, and reproduced 2 millennia later. A lotus seed from a dry lake bed in China was germinated after roughly 1,300 years. A narrow-leafed campion seed, found in squirrel burrows in the Siberian permafrost, was regenerated from tissue approximately 32,000 years old. Seeds are time capsules. They contain everything needed to produce a new plant: DNA, stored energy, a protective coat, and a willingness to wait until the world is ready. A single mature oak tree can produce 70,000 acorns in 1 year, but only 1 in 10,000 will become a tree. The rest are eaten by squirrels, jays, deer, and mice. They are crushed underfoot. They fall in the wrong place. They rot before they can germinate. The oak's strategy is not precision. It is abundance. Flood the world with seeds and let the mathematics of chance do the rest. 1 acorn in 10,000 finds the right patch of soil, the right amount of light, the right season. It sends a root downward and a shoot upward, and if nothing eats it and nothing crushes it and the rain comes at the right time, it becomes a tree that will stand for 500 years and produce 70,000 acorns of its own every single year. The oak does not plan. It does not hope. It simply produces year after year with a generosity so vast that even a success rate of 1/100% is enough to fill a forest. Plants communicate underground through fungal networks that scientists have called the wood wide web. Mycorrhizal fungi attach to the roots of plants and extend outward into the soil, connecting individual plants to each other in a vast subterranean network. Through this network, plants share resources. A tree growing in full sunlight can transfer sugars to a shaded neighbor. A plant under attack from insects can send chemical warning signals through the fungal threads, causing neighboring plants to activate their own defenses before the insects arrive. Mother trees, the largest and oldest in a forest, appear to preferentially send nutrients to their own seedlings, recognizing their offspring through chemical signals. The network is not altruistic. The fungi take a fee, roughly 30% of the sugar the host plant produces. But the partnership is ancient, at least 400 million years old. Your garden is not a collection of individuals. It is a community connected beneath the surface by a web of living threads that you will never see, but that shapes everything above. Bamboo is the fastest growing plant on Earth, and watching it grow is not a figure of speech. Some species of bamboo, particularly those in the genus Philostachys, can grow up to 91 centimeters in a single 24-hour period. The speed is possible because bamboo's cells are already formed inside the shoot before it emerges from the ground. When growth begins, those cells simply expand, inflating with water, pushing the shoot skyward with almost no energy spent on producing new tissue. A bamboo culm can reach its full height in just a few weeks, and once it reaches that height, it never grows taller. It simply matures, its walls hardening over the following years into a material that is stronger, weight for weight, than steel. Bamboo is not a tree, it is a grass, the tallest, fastest, strongest grass in the world. And in a garden, it is either a magnificent screen or an unstoppable invasion, depending on whether you planted a clumping variety or a running one. Choose carefully. The oldest known tree still alive is a bristlecone pine in the White Mountains of California. It is over 4,800 years old. It was already ancient when the pyramids of Giza were being built. It has been standing in the same high, dry, wind-swept landscape for nearly 5 millennia, growing so slowly that its trunk gains only a fraction of a millimeter in diameter each year. The wood is incredibly dense, packed so tightly that bacteria and fungi cannot penetrate it. The conditions that would kill most trees, extreme cold, thin soil, brutal winds, and almost no water, are the very conditions that allow the bristlecone pine to survive. Nothing else can compete with it in that harsh environment. And without competition, it simply endures. Its location is kept secret by the United States Forest Service to protect it from vandalism. It grows alone on a mountainside, surrounded by the bleached, twisted trunks of other bristlecone pines that lived for thousands of years and are now dead, standing like sculptures in the thin mountain air. Tomatoes were feared as poisonous in Europe for over 200 years. When Spanish conquistadors brought them back from the Americas in the 16th century, Europeans regarded them with deep suspicion. They called them wolf peaches. The wealthy ate from pewter plates, which contained high levels of lead. When acidic tomato juice reacted with the lead, it leached the metal into the food, causing lead poisoning and sometimes death. The tomato was blamed. For 2 centuries, it was grown in European gardens only as an ornamental curiosity. In Italy, the tomato was eventually embraced, incorporated into sauces and dishes that would become the foundation of Italian cuisine. But in England and parts of Northern Europe, the fear persisted well into the 18th century. Today, the tomato is the most widely grown garden vegetable in the world. The fruit that was once considered deadly is now so ubiquitous that most people cannot imagine a kitchen garden without one. Carrots were originally purple, not orange. The wild ancestor of the modern carrot produced thin, tough, pale roots that were used medicinally rather than eaten as food. The earliest cultivated carrots grown in Afghanistan and Persia, roughly 1,000 years ago, were purple and yellow. The orange carrot was developed in the Netherlands in the 17th century, possibly as a tribute to William of Orange, though this connection is debated. Dutch growers selectively bred yellow and red carrots to produce a sweeter, less bitter root in a distinctive bright orange, and the new variety spread rapidly across Europe. The orange carrot replaced the purple so completely that most people today do not know that purple carrots ever existed. They did. And they are making a quiet comeback in farmers' markets and heritage seed catalogues, centuries after they were displaced by a colour that matched a flag. The largest living organism on Earth is not a whale or a tree. It is a honey fungus in Oregon's Blue Mountains that covers roughly 2,385 acres, an area larger than 1,500 football pitches. The fungus, Armillaria ostoyi, grows underground as a vast network of dark, string-like filaments called rhizomorphs that spread through the soil and infect the roots of trees. Above ground, you see its effects. Dead and dying trees scattered across the forest, killed by a single organism growing beneath them. The fungus is estimated to be between 2,400 and 8,650 years old. It has been slowly expanding for millennia, consuming the forest from below, one root system at a time. It is a reminder that the largest and oldest living things on the planet are not always the ones you can see. Sometimes they are beneath your feet, quiet and patient, doing their work in the dark. Photosynthesis is the most important chemical reaction on Earth, and every garden is a laboratory where it happens continuously. In the simplest terms, a plant takes sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide and converts them into sugar and oxygen. The sunlight provides the energy, the water provides the hydrogen, the carbon dioxide provides the carbon, the sugar fuels the plant's growth, and the oxygen is released into the air as a byproduct. Every food chain on the planet begins with this reaction. Every calorie you have ever consumed traces back, through however many links, to a plant that captured sunlight and turned it into chemistry. The efficiency of photosynthesis is remarkably low. Only about 1 to 2% of the sunlight that strikes a leaf is actually converted into chemical energy, but the scale is so vast that it powers the entire biosphere. A single large tree can process hundreds of liters of water and absorb kilograms of carbon dioxide every day, producing the oxygen that 2 people need to breathe. When you stand in your garden and look at the green around you, you are looking at a solar-powered chemical factory that has been running continuously for over 3 billion years. Indoor plants can reduce air pollutants by up to 87% within 24 hours. This finding comes from research conducted by NASA in the late 1980s as part of a program to improve air quality inside sealed spacecraft. The study identified several common houseplants, including peace lilies, spider plants, pothos, rubber plants, and dracaenas, that are particularly effective at removing volatile organic compounds like formaldehyde, benzene, and trichloroethylene from the air. The plants absorb these compounds through their leaves, and the microorganisms in the soil around their roots break them down further. The research was conducted in sealed chambers rather than in real-world conditions, so the effect in a typical home is likely more modest. But the principle is real. Plants clean the air. They do it passively, continuously, and silently. A few houseplants on a windowsill will not replace a ventilation system, but they will improve the air quality in a room, reduce dust, increase humidity, and provide the calming psychological benefits that come from sharing your space with something alive and green. Peanuts are not nuts. They are legumes, members of the same family as beans, lentils, and chickpeas. And they grow in one of the most unusual ways of any food crop. The peanut plant produces small yellow flowers above ground, and after pollination, the flower stalk bends downward and pushes into the soil. The fertilized ovary, called a peg, burrows into the earth, and the peanut develops underground in complete darkness. The process is called geocarpy, and it is remarkably rare in the plant kingdom. Peanuts originated in Peru and were spread through the Americas by indigenous farmers long before European contact. They are easy to grow in warm climates, fix nitrogen in the soil through their root nodules, and produce a crop that is rich in protein, healthy fats, and calories. A legume that flowers in the sun and fruits in the dark, doing something that almost no other plant on Earth does. Strawberries are the only fruit that wears its seeds on the outside. Each of the roughly 200 tiny specks on the surface of a strawberry is technically an individual fruit called an achene, and each one contains a single seed. The red, fleshy part that you eat is not actually the fruit at all. It is the swollen receptacle of the flower, the base on which the true fruits sit. This makes the strawberry one of the most structurally unusual foods in the garden. Strawberries are also one of the easiest fruits to grow at home. They thrive in containers, hanging baskets, raised beds, and even window boxes. They produce runners, long stems that reach out across the ground and produce new plants at their tips, making them one of the most generous plants in the garden. Plant a few strawberry plants in spring, and by the following year, you will have dozens, each one producing fruit that tastes nothing like the pale, firm, flavorless berries you find in supermarkets, because a strawberry picked ripe from the garden, still warm from the sun, is an entirely different experience. Avocados were once dispersed by giant ground sloths, and when the sloths went extinct roughly 13,000 years ago, the avocado should have disappeared with them. The fruit evolved to be eaten whole by large Pleistocene megafauna, animals big enough to swallow the enormous seed and carry it in their digestive tract for days before depositing it, with a generous helping of fertilizer, far from the parent tree. When the megafauna vanished, there were no animals left large enough to perform this service. The avocado should have declined into a narrow range, limited to whatever seeds fell close to the parent tree. Instead, humans intervened. Indigenous peoples in Central America began cultivating the avocado at least 5,000 years ago, selecting for larger fruit, thinner skin, and better flavor. They became the avocado's new dispersal agent, carrying it across the Americas and eventually around the world. Every avocado in your kitchen exists because humans took over the job that a giant sloth used to do. The roots of a single rye plant, if laid end to end, would stretch over 600 kilometers. This staggering figure comes from a classic study conducted in the 1930s by the plant physiologist Howard Dittmer, who carefully washed and measured the entire root system of a single winter rye plant, grown for 4 months. He found roughly 14 billion root hairs attached to roughly 13 million rootlets, creating a total absorptive surface area of over 600 square meters. All of this growth occurred in a volume of soil roughly the size of a large bucket. The roots were not spreading widely. They were filling every available space, every crack, every gap between soil particles, with a density that is difficult to comprehend. This is what is happening beneath every plant in your garden, out of sight, in the dark. A silent, relentless expansion into every corner of the soil that contains moisture and nutrients. The part of the plant you see above ground is, for most species, less than half of the total organism. The rest is below, doing the work that makes everything above possible. Trees in a forest coordinate their canopies so that they do not touch, a phenomenon called crown shyness. Viewed from below, the treetops form a jigsaw pattern with narrow channels of light running between them. The effect is most dramatic in species like camphor trees, eucalyptus, and Sitka spruce, where the gaps are consistent and clearly defined. The mechanism is not fully understood. Some researchers believe the trees detect the far red light reflected from neighboring leaves and stop growing in that direction to avoid overlap. Others suggest that the tips of branches are damaged by abrasion during wind and stop growing where contact occurs repeatedly. A third possibility is that the trees are sharing information through chemical signals, coordinating their growth to avoid competition for light. Whatever the cause, the result is a canopy that distributes sunlight more evenly across the forest, allowing more light to reach the understory and supporting a greater diversity of life beneath the trees. Crown shyness is one of the most beautiful patterns in nature, and it is visible only when you lie on the forest floor and look up. A single mature tree can absorb roughly 22 kilograms of carbon dioxide per year and produce enough oxygen for 2 people to breathe. The carbon is not destroyed. It is incorporated into the tree's wood, bark, leaves, and roots, locked away in solid form for as long as the tree stands. A forest is a carbon vault, a vast reservoir of atmospheric carbon removed from the air and stored in living tissue. When a tree is cut down and burned, that stored carbon is released back into the atmosphere. When a tree is left standing, it continues to absorb carbon for its entire lifespan, which for some species can be hundreds or thousands of years. Planting a tree in your garden is one of the simplest and most effective things an individual can do to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The tree does the work. It asks for nothing in return except soil, water, and light. And while it is doing the invisible work of carbon sequestration, it is also providing shade, producing fruit, supporting wildlife, cooling the air, reducing noise, and making your garden a more beautiful place to be. Potatoes were the first vegetable grown in space. In 1995, potato tubers were planted aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia as part of a NASA research program exploring food production for long-duration space missions. The experiment demonstrated that potatoes could be grown in the microgravity environment of low Earth orbit, producing small tubers that were viable and edible. The research was part of a broader effort to develop closed-loop life support systems for future missions to Mars and beyond, where resupply from Earth would be impractical. The potato was chosen because it is one of the most calorie-dense and nutritionally complete crops available, easy to grow in confined spaces, and capable of producing food from small seed tubers rather than requiring the large volumes of soil and water that grain crops demand. The humble potato, a garden staple for centuries, became a pioneer in space agriculture, proving that the skills and knowledge developed over 10,000 years of earthbound gardening might one day feed humans on another world. Butterflies taste with their feet. When a butterfly lands on a leaf or a flower, sensory receptors on the underside of its feet, called chemoreceptors, detect the chemical composition of the surface. Within milliseconds, the butterfly knows whether the plant is a suitable host for its eggs, whether the nectar is worth uncoiling its proboscis for, or whether the surface is something it should leave immediately. This is why butterflies land on things so briefly and so frequently. Each landing is a taste test. A female cabbage white butterfly landing on a brassica leaf can detect the glucosinolates, the bitter sulfur compounds that characterize the cabbage family, through her feet, confirming that this is the correct plant on which to lay her eggs. A painted lady landing on a buddleia flower can taste the sugar concentration of the nectar before she commits to feeding. The garden, to a butterfly, is not a visual experience first. It is a flavor landscape sampled one footstep at a time. Spider silk is stronger than steel by weight, and garden spiders rebuild their entire web every single day. An orb-weaving spider produces silk from specialized glands called spinnerets, and the silk it produces has a tensile strength comparable to high-grade alloy steel, while being roughly a sixth of the density. If you could spin spider silk into a cable the diameter of a pencil, it would be strong enough to stop a Boeing 747 in flight. The spider does not know this. It simply builds. Every evening, many garden spiders eat their old web, recycling the proteins, and spin a new one from scratch. The process takes roughly an hour. The geometry is precise, the radial threads anchored to fixed points, the spiral capture threads laid down with a spacing that maximizes the web's ability to intercept flying insects. The web is covered in tiny droplets of sticky glue that the spider produces from a different gland. The spider itself walks only on the dry radial threads, avoiding its own trap. Every morning, when you see a web glistening with dew in the garden, you are looking at architecture that was built in the dark, from scratch, by an animal the size of your thumbnail, using a material that engineers have spent decades trying to replicate. The first gardens were not decorative. They were fenced enclosures built roughly 10,000 years ago to keep animals out of food crops. When humans in the Fertile Crescent first began cultivating wheat, barley, and lentils, they needed to protect their plantings from wild animals and foraging herds. The earliest gardens were simple barriers, walls of stone or hedges of thorn, surrounding patches of cultivated ground. The word garden itself comes from the Old English geard, meaning an enclosed space, a yard, a boundary between the wild and the tended. For most of human history, gardens were practical, not beautiful. They existed to grow food, to grow medicine, and to keep the chaos of the natural world at a manageable distance. the ornamental garden, the garden designed purely for pleasure, would not emerge for thousands of years. But the impulse was there from the beginning. The desire to take a piece of the earth, enclose it, tend it, and make it yours. That impulse is as old as civilization itself. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, may never have existed at all. Ancient Greek and Roman writers described them in vivid detail. A towering structure of terraced gardens rising above the city, watered by an ingenious system that lifted water from the Euphrates to the highest levels. The gardens were said to have been built by King Nebuchadnezzar II around 600 BC for his wife, who missed the green hills of her homeland. But no Babylonian text ever mentions them. No archaeological evidence has been found at the site of Babylon. Some historians now believe the gardens may have been located in Nineveh rather than Babylon, or that they were a literary invention that grew more elaborate with each retelling. The most famous garden in human history may be the one that never was. The gardens of Versailles required 30,000 workers to build and consumed more iron in their construction than the Eiffel Tower would 2 centuries later. André Le Nôtre transformed an unpromising swamp into the most elaborate formal garden the world had ever seen. Forests were relocated, hills were constructed. A vast system of canals and aqueducts fed over 1,400 fountains. The Grand Canal alone stretches over 1.6 kilometers. The parterres, intricate geometric patterns of clipped hedges and colored gravel, were maintained by an army of gardeners working year-round. The gardens were not just beautiful, they were a statement of absolute power, a demonstration that the king could reshape the landscape itself to match his vision. Nature was not celebrated at Versailles. It was subjugated, trimmed, and forced into symmetry. The most magnificent and the most unnatural garden ever built. During World War II, 20 million Victory Gardens in the United States produced roughly 40% of the country's fresh vegetables. The movement began in 1942, when citizens were encouraged to plant food in backyards, vacant lots, and rooftops to supplement the commercial food supply. By 1944, the gardens were producing an estimated 10 billion pounds of food per year. Eleanor Roosevelt planted one at the White House. Schools enrolled children in gardening programs. The message was simple: growing food was a form of national service. The Victory Garden movement demonstrated something that had been true for 10,000 years, but forgotten in the age of supermarkets. A person with a patch of soil and a packet of seeds can feed themselves. The gardens disappeared after the war, but the idea resurfaces every time a crisis reminds people that food does not come from shops. It comes from the ground. Monks in medieval Europe were the first systematic gardeners in the Western world. While the knowledge of classical civilization collapsed around them, Benedictine and Cistercian monks cultivated medicinal herb gardens called physic gardens within their monastery walls. These gardens preserved the botanical knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans through centuries of upheaval. The monks grew healing herbs like yarrow, chamomile, lavender, sage, and fennel, and they recorded their observations with a discipline that anticipated modern scientific method. The monastery garden was typically divided into 4 sections: the herbularius for medicinal plants, the hortus for vegetables, the viridarium for fruit trees, and the garth, the central cloister garden used for contemplation. The physic garden was not just a source of medicine, it was a library, a laboratory, and a pharmacy combined, maintained by men who understood that the knowledge of what grows and how to use it was too important to lose. Japanese Zen gardens use raked gravel, stones, and moss to represent entire landscapes without using any water at all. The dry landscape garden, called Kare-sansui, originated in the 14th and 15th centuries at Zen Buddhist temples in Kyoto. The most famous, Ryoanji, consists of 15 stones arranged on a bed of white gravel within a walled rectangle. The gravel is raked daily into patterns that suggest rippling water. The stones are placed so that from any single viewpoint, at least one stone is always hidden. The garden is not meant to be entered. It is meant to be viewed from a seated position on the temple veranda, contemplated in stillness. Every element is symbolic. The gravel represents the ocean, the stones represent mountains or islands. The moss growing at the base of some stones represents forests. The emptiness between the elements is not absence. It is the most important part of the composition. A garden that grows nothing, produces nothing, and changes only when a monk takes a rake to the gravel each morning. And yet, it is considered one of the most profound gardens ever created. The Alhambra Gardens in Granada, Spain, are one of the finest examples of Islamic paradise garden design. Built by the Nasrid dynasty in the 13th and 14th centuries, the gardens are organized around the concept of the Shahar Bagh, the fourfold garden divided by water channels representing the 4 rivers of paradise described in the Quran. Water is the central element. It flows through narrow channels, collects in still pools that reflect the architecture above, and falls from fountains whose sound is designed to be heard from every courtyard. Shade from citrus trees and cypresses cools the air. The fragrance of jasmine, rose, and orange blossom fills the enclosed spaces. The geometry is precise. Every pathway, every planting, every water feature calculated to create an experience of order, beauty, and tranquility. The Islamic garden was never meant to imitate nature. It was meant to improve upon it, to create a space where every sense was engaged and every element was in harmony. The Mughal gardens surrounding the Taj Mahal were designed as an earthly representation of paradise. The garden follows the Chahar Bagh plan, divided into 4 quadrants by raised walkways over water channels that meet at a central pool. The symmetry is absolute. Every tree, every flower bed, every pathway on one side of the central axis is mirrored on the other. The planting originally included hundreds of fruit trees and flowering shrubs chosen for their fragrance and symbolic meaning. The garden was not a setting for the mausoleum. It was part of the mausoleum, an integral element of the architectural and spiritual program. The Taj Mahal was built as a vision of paradise on earth, and the garden was paradise itself, the place where the soul would rest in beauty, symmetry, and peace. The world's oldest botanical garden still in operation is in Padua, Italy, founded in 1545 to grow medicinal plants for the university's medical faculty. Before the garden existed, students relied on illustrations in books that were often inaccurate, leading to dangerous misidentifications. The garden provided living specimens correctly labeled for direct observation. The original circular design is still intact. Over nearly 5 centuries, the garden has housed some of the most important plant introductions in European history. Sunflowers, potatoes, jasmine, and acacia all grew in Padua before spreading across the continent. A garden built to prevent poisoning is still growing, still teaching, and still open. The Chelsea Flower Show has been held in London since 1913, and a gold medal is considered one of the highest honours in the gardening world. The show, organised by the Royal Horticultural Society, takes place over 5 days each May in the grounds of the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. Show gardens, designed by the world's leading garden designers, are built from scratch in the weeks before the show and dismantled immediately after. The attention to detail is extraordinary. Trees are craned into position. Water features are plumbed and tested. Every plant is placed with precision that borders on obsession. The show attracts roughly 150,000 visitors and is broadcast to millions. It sets trends in garden design that ripple outward through nurseries, garden centres, and back gardens across the country for years afterward. A gold medal at Chelsea can define a career. The show is competitive, theatrical, and deeply serious about something that, from the outside, looks like an elaborate arrangement of plants in a temporary space. But to the people who build the gardens, it is art. The ancient Persians invented the walled garden, and their word for it became the English word paradise. The Persian paradisa, meaning a walled enclosure, described a garden surrounded by high walls that kept out the dust, heat, and chaos of the desert. Inside, water flowed through channels. Trees provided shade, flowers scented the air. The garden was a refuge, a place of order and beauty in a harsh landscape. When the Greeks encountered these Persian gardens during the wars of the 5th century BC, they adopted the word and the concept. Paradisos entered Greek, then Latin, then Old French, and eventually English as paradise. The idea of heaven as a garden present in Christianity, Islam, and many other traditions traces back to the Persian conviction that a walled, watered, carefully tended garden was the most perfect place a human being could inhabit. Paradise is not a metaphor borrowed from gardens. Gardens are an attempt to build paradise on earth, and the word itself remembers where the idea began. Allotment gardens originated in 19th century Britain as plots of land rented to the urban poor so they could grow their own food. The Allotments Act of 1887 required local authorities to provide land for this purpose, and the tradition has continued for over a century. A standard allotment plot is roughly 250 square meters, large enough to feed a family of 4 with vegetables for the year. During both World Wars, allotments were essential to the national food supply. In peacetime, they became places of community, quiet industry, and deeply personal expression. No two allotment plots look the same. Some are immaculate, some are wildly overgrown. All of them are tended by people who understand that growing your own food is not just about saving money. It is about the satisfaction of eating something you planted with your own hands. In soil, you improved with your own compost, in a space that is yours for as long as you are willing to work it. The oldest known garden plan is a wall painting from an Egyptian tomb, dating to roughly 1400 BC. It shows a rectangular pool surrounded by rows of date palms, sycamores, and grapevines. The garden is formal, symmetrical, and clearly designed for both beauty and productivity. The pool would have served as a source of irrigation water, a habitat for fish, and a place of cool relief from the Egyptian heat. The painting tells us that over 3,000 years ago, people were not just growing food. They were designing outdoor spaces with the same care and intention that they brought to their architecture and their art. The impulse to arrange plants in a pattern, to create a space that is both useful and beautiful, is as old as recorded history. Thomas Jefferson's garden at Monticello grew over 300 varieties of vegetables and 170 varieties of fruit. Jefferson kept detailed garden diaries for over 50 years, recording planting dates, harvest yields, weather observations, and the performance of every variety he trialed. He corresponded with gardeners across Europe and the Americas, exchanging seeds and sharing results. He grew vegetables that were considered exotic in 18th century Virginia, including tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and okra. His garden was not just a food source, it was an experiment. a lifelong investigation into what could be grown, how it could be improved, and what the soil and climate of Virginia would support. Jefferson called the garden the greatest of all amusements, and he returned to it throughout his life with an enthusiasm that never diminished. A founding father whose happiest hours were spent on his knees in the dirt, planting seeds. The Wardian case, a sealed glass container invented in 1829, allowed living plants to survive months-long sea voyages and transformed the global movement of species. Before the Wardian case, transporting plants by ship was almost impossible. Salt spray killed the leaves. Sailors used the fresh water meant for the plants. The plants rotted in the damp hold or dried out on deck. Survival rates were as low as 1 in 1,000. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward, a London doctor with a passion for ferns, accidentally discovered that plants could thrive inside a sealed glass container. The moisture they transpired condensed on the glass and dripped back into the soil, creating a self-sustaining water cycle. Ward's invention revolutionized the plant trade. Rubber trees were transported from South America to Malaysia. Tea plants moved from China to India. Cinchona trees, the source of quinine, were carried from the Andes to the plantations of Southeast Asia. The Wardian case reshaped the agriculture of entire continents, moving plants across oceans in a sealed box that weighed less than a suitcase. Greenhouse technology dates back to Roman times. The Emperor Tiberius reportedly demanded fresh cucumbers every day of the year, and his gardeners obliged by growing them on wheeled carts that were moved outdoors during the day and sheltered under frames covered with translucent sheets of selenite, a mineral that allowed light through while trapping heat. The plants were taken inside at night. It was not a greenhouse in the modern sense, but the principle was the same. Using a transparent barrier to create a warmer microclimate that extends the growing season. After the fall of Rome, effective greenhouse technology disappeared for over 1,000 years, only to re-emerge in the Italian Renaissance and the Dutch Golden Age when glass became affordable enough to build structures large enough to house entire collections of tropical plants. The Orangery, a grand glass and stone building designed to overwinter citrus trees, became a status symbol in the great gardens of Europe. Today, a greenhouse is one of the most useful structures a gardener can own. It extends the season at both ends, protects tender crops from frost, and allows seed starting weeks before the last frost date. The Romans knew this 2,000 years ago. The technology changed. The principle never did. Charles Darwin's garden at Down House in Kent was one of the most important scientific laboratories of the 19th century. For over 40 years, Darwin conducted experiments in the garden and the grounds surrounding his home, using plants as his primary subjects. He studied the movement of climbing plants, documenting how tendrils search for support, with a rotating motion he called circumnutation. He investigated the digestive mechanisms of sundews and Venus flytraps, feeding them precisely measured amounts of protein and recording the results. He spent 39 years studying earthworms, publishing his final book on the subject in 1881. He built a sandwalk, a gravel path through a small wood at the edge of his property, and walked it daily, thinking through his ideas while counting laps with a row of flint stones that he kicked aside one by one. The garden at Down House was not a hobby. It was the place where some of the most important ideas in the history of science were tested, observed, and refined, one plant, one worm, one quiet afternoon at a time. The Keukenhof Gardens in the Netherlands plant roughly 7 million flower bulbs by hand every autumn, for a display that lasts only 8 weeks each spring. The bulbs, mostly tulips, daffodils, hyacinths, and crocuses, are planted in elaborate patterns designed by a team of landscape architects and then covered with soil and mulch to overwinter. When the garden opens in mid-March, the first crocuses and early daffodils are already in bloom. By late April, the tulips are at their peak, and the garden is a sea of colour so dense and so vivid that photographs of it look artificially saturated. Then, in mid-May, the show ends. The flowers are cut, the bulbs are lifted, the beds are cleared and replanted with summer annuals. The entire spectacle, 7 million bulbs, 8 weeks of beauty, and then gone. It is one of the most extravagant acts of horticultural devotion on the planet, and it happens every year, as it has since 1950. The practice of forest gardening, growing food in layers that mimic a natural forest, has been used in tropical regions for over 10,000 years and is one of the oldest forms of agriculture on Earth. A forest garden has a canopy layer of tall fruit and nut trees, an understory of smaller fruit trees and bushes, a shrub layer of currants and berries, a herbaceous layer of perennial vegetables and herbs, a ground cover layer of creeping plants, a root layer of tubers and rhizomes, and a climbing layer of vines. Each layer occupies a different vertical space, and together they produce food continuously with minimal maintenance once established. The system mimics the structure of a natural forest, where every layer is filled and every niche is occupied. Forest gardens in Kerala, Sri Lanka, and Tanzania have been productive for generations, providing food, medicine, fuel, and building materials from a single plot. The concept has been adapted for temperate climates under the name food forest, and it is now practiced by permaculture designers worldwide as a model for sustainable, low-input food production. Permaculture, a system of garden and land design based on the patterns and relationships found in natural ecosystems, was developed in Australia in the 1970s by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. The word is a contraction of permanent agriculture and permanent culture, reflecting the founders' vision of food systems that sustain themselves without depleting the resources they depend on. Permaculture principles include working with nature rather than against it, using each element for multiple functions, capturing and storing energy, producing no waste, and designing from patterns to details. A permaculture garden might include a food forest, a rainwater harvesting system, a composting toilet, a herb spiral, and a chicken coop, all designed to connect to each other so that the output of one system becomes the input of another. The philosophy has spread to every continent and is now applied not only to gardens, but to buildings, communities, and entire landscapes. The concept of rewilding, allowing cultivated or degraded land to return to its natural state, has been shown to restore biodiversity, rebuild soil, and sequester carbon more effectively than most human interventions. The most famous example is the Knepp estate in West Sussex, where a conventional farm was taken out of production in 2001 and allowed to revert to a self-sustaining landscape. Within 2 decades, rare species of birds, butterflies, and mammals returned, soil health improved dramatically, and the land became a model for conservation. Rewilding does not mean abandoning the land. It means stepping back and allowing natural processes to do the work that human management cannot replicate. In a garden context, rewilding a corner, leaving it unmown, unweeded, and undisturbed, creates habitat for wildlife that the rest of the garden cannot support. The wild patch is not neglect. It is the most generous thing you can do for the creatures that share your space. Gardening reduces cortisol levels more effectively than reading indoors. A 2011 study published in the Journal of Health Psychology divided participants into 2 groups after a stressful task. One group gardened for 30 minutes. The other read indoors for 30 minutes. Both activities reduced cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, but the gardening group showed significantly greater reduction. The gardeners also reported more complete recovery of positive mood. The researchers suggested that the combination of physical activity, exposure to natural light, contact with soil, and the focused attention required by garden tasks created a uniquely effective stress reduction experience. Other studies have confirmed and extended these findings. Gardening has been associated with reduced symptoms of depression and anxiety, improved self-esteem, and enhanced social connection in community garden settings. The garden is not just a place where things grow. It is a place where the person doing the growing becomes calmer, healthier, and more at peace with the rhythms of the natural world. Gardening is the only art form where the canvas is alive. A painting, once finished, stays finished. A sculpture does not change after the chisel is put down. A building does not grow new rooms in the spring, but a garden is never complete. It grows, it changes, it responds to the weather, the seasons, the soil, and the gardener's care in ways that no other medium does. A border that was perfect in June looks different in September. A tree that was a sapling when you planted it is now taller than the house. A rose that struggled for 3 years suddenly explodes into bloom in its 4th. The garden is always becoming something new, always in the process of arriving at a state that it will never quite reach, because the moment it gets there, the next season begins and the process starts again. This is what makes gardening different from every other creative act. You are not making something. You are collaborating with something. The soil, the light, the rain, the roots, the worms, the invisible billions of organisms beneath the surface, all of them are your partners, and the garden you make together is alive in a way that no other work of art can be. And that is where we will leave it tonight. 100 facts about gardens and gardening, from the 10 billion microbes in a teaspoon of soil to the monks who saved botanical knowledge through the Dark Ages. From the finger test that is more reliable than any moisture meter to the Three Sisters companion planting system that fed nations for centuries. From the compost heap that transforms waste into black gold to the worms that Darwin loved more than finches. From the Persian walled garden that gave us the word paradise, to the wildflower meadow that hums with 50 times more life than the lawn it replaced. From the seed that waited 2,000 years in a desert fortress to the bristlecone pine that has been growing since before the pyramids were built. Every garden is a conversation between the gardener and the earth. And the earth, if you listen to it, if you feed it and tend it and give it time, always answers. You do not need to remember any of it. The soil will still be there in the morning. The seeds will still be waiting. The worms will still be working in the dark. For now, there is nothing left to plant, nothing to water, nothing to tend, just rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts soften. Let the quiet patience of growing things carry you gently towards sleep. Thank you for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Good night.